Well, Broncos fans, you can't say I didn't try to warn you. Football fans, you also can't say that I didn't try to tell you so. After the 2013 season, I came on in here and guaranteed that the Denver Broncos would not make it back to Super Bowl 49. There were just too many things pointing against it, most specifically history. It's been over 20 years going back to the Bills of the early 90s since a Super Bowl loser made it back to the Super Bowl the following season. Times it comes to a certain point, and then when you don't get it there, there's a bit of a Super Bowl hangover. But there's also a thing of this was the best you were going to be, and then you're going to go downhill from here. A lot of people didn't think that was going to be the case for the Denver Broncos heading into 2014. History be damned, because history is made, but history can also be changed and be rewritten. And I understand why a lot of people might have had that philosophy heading into this season. The Broncos were going to have so many key players coming back, namely Von Miller, their best player on defense, Ryan Clady, their big-time left tackle, arguably their best offensive lineman for sure, and several other guys that had been injured throughout the year, Chris Harris, and so on and so forth. So with all these big names coming back from injury, combined with the fact that Elway was so aggressive and made so many moves in the offseason via free agency, a lot of people, a lot of the media, I think, expected, somewhat foolishly, admittedly, that the Denver Broncos were still going to go back to Super Bowl 49, that they were going to be the premier team in the AFC. Well, just because you do this, and just because you have guys coming back from injury, and just because you have these guys coming in, that doesn't always necessarily guarantee anything. Now, to be fair to the Denver Broncos, it's not exactly they had a totally disastrous 2014. I mean, this was still a team that coming off of a Super Bowl loss where a lot of lesser organizations, a lot of lesser teams would have imploded the following season. We've seen that so many times in recent years. The Broncos came back out, went 12-4, won the AFC West, got themselves a first-round bye. They handled business where they needed to, going 6-0 in their division. I mean, they didn't really have a ton of significant injuries nearly to the level of what they did in 2014. And when you look at some of the pieces that they brought in, DeMarcus Ware had a great season as the opposite pass rusher of Von Miller. I mean, him and Von Miller were quite a freaky force for a good portion of the 2014 season. Emmanuel Sanders was a big coup get for John Elway in the offseason, not only wrestling him away from the Kansas City Chiefs and weakening them when they thought they had Sanders in the works, but he actually, frankly, became a big-time upgrade over what they had in Eric Decker. I mean, Sanders had over 100 catches, I think 1,300 receiving yards or 1,200 receiving yards. He had a nice season. He was their most consistent, reliable option that they had on offense, in my opinion. This was a team, you got Clady back. This was a team that brought in Aqib Talib, who was an upgrade to a certain degree over Dominique Rodgers-Cromartie. You got Chris Harris came back from his injury, not only came back from his injury, but came back from his injury even better and played, frankly, at an all-pro level. There's just so many things about this team that I could see why people would say this and why people thought that this team was destined for a return trip to Super Bowl 49. But there were reasons why it didn't happen. First, you have to look at the fact that Peyton Manning did still have a very good statistical season, but he regressed late in the year. His arm went to limp noodle status by the time it was all said and done. I mean, people can make up these imaginary quad injuries and talk about this, but the bottom line is that as the season progressed, Peyton Manning regressed. I think teams started to realize and catch up with the reality that this wasn't the same guy and started to game plan more effectively against him. Now, while the Broncos had C.J. Anderson emerge as kind of that featured back later on in the year, this was a team that struggled to run the ball early on in the season and really lacked an identity there at certain times, even though Ronnie Hillman himself had some very nice games. Again, it was a team that lacked that consistency in the effort in the running game and furthermore lacked the balance that was necessary, and they were too Peyton reliant. They were too through the air reliant, and that really caught up with them late in the year and in particular in the divisional round against the Colts. You had Demaryius Thomas had a big year in terms of numbers, but man, he had some bad drops, and man, he really disappeared at times. For a guy that's such a big-time special explosive weapon in the National Football League, he had far too many instances where he just disappeared or he just failed to make consistent plays, let alone the big ones. You had Julius Thomas, who at one point in time was going to look like he was having a record-setting season as a tight end, and then injuries and everything else just kind of led to him being not a factor anymore. Defensively, though, you look at this team and you say they were second against the run in the league, top 10 in the league against the pass, top 10 in the league in generating pressure on opposing quarterbacks. Where did it go wrong? Where it kind of went wrong was in terms of the fit, in terms of the chemistry. That's where it went wrong. John Elway spent so much on trying to fix that defense in the offseason, like so many fans foolishly and media foolishly thought was the only real problem with the Broncos, that he failed to effectively address the offensive side of the ball. You lose Noshawn Moreno, you lose Eric Decker, and you bring in Emmanuel Sanders, but you really don't find that legitimate replacement for Moreno. Anderson developed into that, and he became a force for them late in the year, but they really missed not having Noshawn Moreno there. They had big problems on that offensive line, especially later on in the season, protecting Peyton Manning. While the sack numbers don't show it, if you watch those games, you could see where Peyton Manning later on in the year, especially in games like against St. Louis and to a degree against the Indianapolis Colts, you could see where Peyton Manning was having a lot of pressure bearing down on him, and he's not the type of quarterback that's going to be able to move and buy a lot of time with his feet outside of the pocket. And when you have to start asking him to do that, you're in trouble in a bad way defensively. Yes, they brought in DeMarcus Ware, and he had a really good season as a pass rusher, but with that said, you look at them bringing in T.J. Ward. They needed a real center fielder type of free safety. They brought in an in-the-box strong safety. They were still really weak in the linebacking core at the middle linebacker position, lacking any type of real playmaking there. They had some troubles at the weak side position opposite Von Miller with Brandon Marshall getting hurt and then Trevathan being hurt. They had problems there. It was just something was off and something was missed. And they, again, became too Peyton Manning reliant. Instead of following the formula that the Broncos followed in the late 90s with John Elway, and that was surrounding him with the defense, surrounding him with pieces on offense, giving him that running game, and just allowing him to pick and choose his spots, they wanted Peyton Manning to have too many spots. They let Peyton Manning have too much control. And what happened? The shit blew up in their face in the divisional round against the Colts. And they got owned at home in a bad way, in an embarrassing way, especially when you look and see what the Colts did the next week in the AFC Championship game against the New England Patriots. This is a critical offseason for this Denver Broncos team. Gone is John Fox. Gone is defensive coordinator Jack Del Rio. Gone is offensive facilitator / coordinator Adam Gase. And in comes Gary Kubiak. Is Peyton Manning going to return? Is Peyton Manning going to retire? What are they going to do with Demaryius Thomas and Julius Thomas, two big, important, explosive weapons, top guys at their position in the league that are both free agents now? What are you going to do? Are you going to be able to re-sign one or both of them? Are you going to have to let both of them go or one of them go because of salary cap constraints? If you are all in 2015 with Peyton Manning one more time, with bringing Gary Kubiak in, what are you going to do to adjust your philosophy and your approach? What are you going to do to change things so that way you improve your results in 2015 instead of being even worse? Well, first thing they need to do is they need to address their offensive line. They need help at right tackle badly. Badly. I would also argue they need some help on the interior line of that and at the guard position. Because at the end of the day, as long as Peyton Manning's there, that's the identity of your team, like it or not. As long as Peyton Manning is your quarterback, you have to help him out. And I don't think Elway's done nearly a good enough job of building up that offensive line in front of Peyton Manning, especially knowing the type of quarterback that he is. He's put Peyton Manning in some really bad situations. And now the good thing is you bring in a Gary Kubiak with that zone blocking running system, that one cut and go running system. Maybe he can rein in Peyton some. Maybe he could take back some of the control over that offense over Peyton Manning, and he could force the Broncos to be a more balanced football team on offense, and that would pay big dividends. But in order to do that, they need to address their weaknesses on the offensive line, right tackle and inside at guard. Then on defense, one thing they could really use is a middle linebacker that matters, a middle linebacker that can make some plays. They just don't have that. And they desperately need that. Because when you've got a Von Miller that frankly is pretty one-dimensional as a linebacker, and you don't really have anything special on the other side, you need somebody in the middle that could do a lot of different things and do them very well. And again, they just don't have it. The other thing that the Denver Broncos could use, with all the pass rush they got from Von Miller and DeMarcus Ware on the outside, they really didn't get much of a pass rush from the interior. They need a defensive tackle, whether they re-sign Terrence Knighton or not, and especially if they don't re-sign Terrence Knighton, they need a three-gap penetrating defensive tackle. They need a defensive tackle that can generate some consistent pass rush from the interior, because with the Denver Broncos, when you started to figure out that, by and large, our biggest pass rush threat is on the outside, if we slow those guys down, I'll take my chances with the interior and feel pretty good about it. The Broncos defense doesn't nearly have the bite that many expected would. When it comes to the Denver Broncos heading into this offseason, this is a real organization and franchise changer. Do they go all in for one more go at it, or does the infrastructure start to slowly crumble? Does Peyton Manning retire? Do Thomas and Thomas, one or both of them, go? Does this team start to get old? There's going to be some interesting questions. There's going to be a lot of turmoil and a lot of questions to be answered about the Denver Broncos this offseason. If they answer some of these questions and they do some of the things that are necessary, they'll be a contender in the AFC. But if you expect them to get to the Super Bowl and you expect them to win a Super Bowl with Peyton Manning at quarterback at this point in time, you're probably fooling yourself.